An indigenous community in Canada says it's found 751 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school in Saskatchewan province. It says it's unclear how many of the graves belong to children. It comes weeks after the remains of 215 children were found at the site of another former residential school in British Columbia. In a statement, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said no child should ever have been taken away from their families and communities and robbed of their language, culture and identity. Together we must acknowledge this truth, learn from our past and walk the shared path of reconciliation so we can build a better future. Well, Chief Bobby Cameron is from the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. It represents 74 First Nations in the province of Saskatchewan, and he gave the BBC his reaction.
Down in Germany, they had concentration camps. Well, we had them here in Saskatchewan. They were called residential schools. This was a crime against humanity, an assault on our First Nation people. We are proud people. For all of our survivors who have told these stories for decades and decades and decades, because they lived it, they've seen it, they witnessed it, they've experienced all these horrific acts on our own children. Now people are believing them because you cannot deny these bodies that are being found.
Well, for more on the history of residential schools in Canada, I spoke in the last hour with Tricia Logan. Tricia is Head of Research and Engagement at the Residential School History and Dialogue Centre at the University of British Columbia.
Over 150 schools that operated in Canada for over 150 years. They opened in the late 1800s, and the last school, like Merivale, was closed in 1997. So they operated in Canada for a long time and in almost every province and territory of Canada. The origins of the schools were based on an industrial boarding school model that's used in a lot of different countries where Indigenous children in Canada, First Nations, Métis and Inuit children were for a long time forcibly taken from their parents as kind of a broad, systematic effort on the behalf of the government of Canada and churches, the Catholic and Protestant churches in Canada, to forcibly assimilate and try to civilize or Christianize Indigenous children for a long time forcibly and for several generations. There's a lot of Indigenous families that had generations of their family attend these schools.
In effect, kind of wiping out the past and trying to turn these children into something they weren't. But what else happened in these schools beyond a kind of almost a sort of propagandizing, is it what one might term it, cultural propagandizing? What happened in terms of how these children were treated, and why might there be so many graves?
Yeah, from the start, from the time that children were coming home and survivors had returned from the schools, and part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada was to listen to the stories of survivors that told about the realities of these schools, the truths of these schools, because the way they operated were not like schools at all. There was very little kind of day-to-day education, and a lot of the schools became very notorious in Canada for high rates of disease and death, as well as high rates of physical and sexual abuse and neglect, malnutrition, very, very poor food or access to food, and just very cruel punishment throughout the administration of all of these schools as kind of also a very systemic set of schools in all parts of Canada, very forcibly and systematically removing children from their homes and affecting generations of those communities.
Tricia Logan talking to me a little earlier.